We will have Joe introduce himself and discuss a little bit more some presentations as well. Um, so I will let Joe if you're ready for that.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm so grateful for this invitation to join all of you to talk about this really important issue. It's a little intimidating to follow in the wake of Commissioner Anderson. That was a fantastic presentation and born really from an activist on the ground, in-person experience. You get the passion, you get the urgency of the issue, you have concrete action steps. What a fantastic orientation to this really pressing concern. I'm going to abstract out a little bit from that and what I have to say today. We were asked to talk for about 10 to 13 minutes, which is not very long. And since it's hard to gauge sometimes where the interest lies with an audience, I'm going to just put several things on the table, sort of, just jumping across various things. And then you can follow up with exchange and questions and comments about which of those you might like to trace out. So thanks again for having me. I should say I'm talking to you from Cambridge, Mass, which is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts tribe. And I've been at Harvard for a couple of years now. And so let me start by sharing my screen here so I can take you through some slides as well. Great. I'm hoping you're all seeing that just fine. And so let me start again, just introducing myself briefly, from the perspective of professional introduction. I'm a college professor, obviously. I'm a research psychologist. I'm trained clinically, but I don't really practice clinically. And I'm also a kind of minor administrator at Harvard, where I'm the faculty director of the Harvard University Native American program. I started that about a year ago, and I only arrived 2 years ago. So it's been a bit of a learning curve, but very exciting and interesting and important to serve the Native community here at Harvard. Personally, I'm an enrolled member of the Ani-Grovant Tribal Nation of Montana. We are on the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation in north central Montana with the Dakota people, and I have some Dakota ancestry as well. I was born and reared in Montana, although I did not grow up on my reservation. And I'm a husband, I'm a father. You can see my family here to the right. We were downtown Boston and took a family with my spouse and my kids and my spouse's mother. I want to start just by talking about Indigenous representations. You've already gotten Commissioner Anderson's nice overview of these issues. But there are many instances in which we're so familiar with what it means to think about and recognize Indians in broader society. And what I wanted to point out is that we really have a paradox of Indigenous representations in this nation. On the one hand, Indians are everywhere. Everyone who grows up in America, if you were to track and chart in a day's everyday life, you would find street names and city names and commercial products you buy in the grocery store and mascots around you, cartoons on TV, etc. So we're everywhere in the same sense that real living Indigenous people are almost nowhere. Most Americans don't know any living American Indian people, or they don't know that they know living American Indian people. And so this paradox is really interesting because it's given rise and fueled a whole set of representations that Indian people themselves really don't control. And therefore, it creates this disjuncture that Commissioner Anderson helped to describe. This is a very famous Indian representation in this photo. It's called The End of the Trail. It was an original sculpture by an artist named Fraser. And I have a funny story about this because when I was interviewing for an early professor job at the University of Michigan almost 20 years ago now, I remember arriving the night before. It was a very couple days of intense interviewing to see if I was up to snuff for getting a faculty job there. And I'd hardly slept that night out of anxiety. I walked downstairs, got the elevator, the elevator doors grew open as I was walking out to meet the person who could escort me through my interviews. And I saw this statue standing right outside the elevators. I thought, oh my God, this can't be a good omen. I was very concerned about it. But years later, when I got tenure, I actually went back to this hotel and I took my little coup stick and I counted coup on this statue because, these kinds of representations actually matter psychologically for Indian people. And again, they're everywhere and they're not of our own making. I went to graduate school at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And at the time I went to graduate school, I had to be thrust right into what we call the politics of representation. Politics of representation. So what do I mean by that? Really, the politics of representation entails the exercise of influence and power as expressed through the creation, dissemination, and control of imagery, narrative, and discourse pertaining to people and activities and events. And so, this is really salient in the representation of marginalized racial minorities and all kinds of other folks who have been marginalized and disadvantaged in American society. And so these representations are everywhere. There's a politics associated with them. And part of what's important is, of course, to take stock of those politics. These played out for me in real time at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I applied to get my doctorate in clinical community psychology there. It looked like the best fit for the interests I had. And I showed up there to interview to see if they would accept me as a graduate student. And I had asked to meet with some Indian graduate students. So I met with a Pima guy named Olin Perkins, who was getting his, I think it was his MFA there. And we met in this bar just right on campus there. And I remember he said, "You don't want to come here. It's bad. They have this mascot. He dances at halftime. It's not a good place for Indians." And I was so confused about what this could be like for a community. I couldn't get my mind around how this mascot could interrupt and interfere in people's lives. Well, I had the best graduate school experience of anyone I know. So I loved graduate school there, even as, because of Chief Illiniwek, who you see on the right, which is a university undergraduate who actually competes and tries out to perform this mascot, jumps and dances and does all this stereotypical war whooping dressed like this for halftime in football and basketball and so on. I didn't conceive really of what that could mean for an Indian community, but being there, we were obligated to try to persuade the university powers that be that this is not acceptable. This is an institution of higher education, and you are miseducating generations of students with this kind of stereotypical performance. And so as we grew organized and active about how to overcome this, which we were not effective at doing during the time I was there, it was another decade or so before the move to end Chief Illiniwek was successful, I learned a lot about the history of this tradition. And one thing that was interesting about it is the very first Chief Illiniwek was an undergraduate student at Illinois who in 1926, first performed as this mascot, and he had gotten it from his participation in the Boy Scouts of America. So I think now then about some of the work that my colleague here at Harvard, the Dakota scholar and historian Philip Deloria, wrote an entire book called Playing Indian. And this book about playing Indian is an analysis of the ways that Americans have performed Indianness at various historical junctures, going back, of course, to the American Revolution with the Boston Tea Party, patriots and revolutionaries dressing up as Indian to throw tea off the ships. And Phil has charted different ways throughout American history where Americans have found some kind of purchase by performing Indianness. And in some ways, Deloria argues Indianness offered a deep, authentic, Aboriginal Americanness through these kinds of performances. And so, it has to do with the closing of the frontier at a particular moment where Americans had to find a new way to cast their identity. Obviously, the rise of modernity. People were concerned about urban existence becoming more effeminate than traditional agricultural rural existence. And so Americans found that playing Indian was one way to try counter these kinds of tendencies, these kinds of attributes, and to basically participate as authentic Americans who were truly different than Europeans and their places of origin, to fuse, if you will, almost with an indigenous experience, thereby to proclaim themselves a free and emancipated nation. Now, this played out in the Boy Scouts of America because, first there was Daniel Beard and the Sons of Daniel Boone, which were celebrating kind of the progressive pioneer legacy, as Phil traces out. And then you had Ernest Thompson Seton, who developed the Woodcraft League of America, which really drew on Indian legacy stuff for young people to get organized and participate in. And that merged with the Boy Scouts of America in 1910. And so if you start to look at where these mascots come from, you will often find Boy Scouts of America behind them. The Boy Scouts of America for a long time had the Order of the Arrow, which was a special sub-society of the Boy Scouts where playing Indian was what it was all about. So you see a picture here on the left of the Order of the Arrow kind of activities that Boy Scouts would participate in. And so this playing Indian, is very, very common as an American experience for a long time. And it's really been most carefully and comprehensively represented in the Disney film Peter Pan. I don't know when the last time is you all watched Peter Pan, but In contrast to lots of other Disney films that have been edited or even removed from circulation, like Song of the South, which has all these stereotypical representations of Black people in the South with Uncle Remus and Brer Rabbit and all of that, or even in Fantasia, which has a segment with Beethoven's Sixth, I think, where, it has actually like Black or quote Pickaninny, unquote, representations of different of those creatures that have been edited out of those cartoons. You can walk down to Best Buy or order on Amazon Peter Pan today and get 10 minutes of the most incredibly racist, stereotypical caricature of Indian people and Indian life that you can see. And I think it was just last month that I saw that for the very first time, Disney grew a conscience around this, and now at least has a disclaimer on this video disc that says, look, there's a problematic representation if you watch this movie. So at least that's there, but this is pitched to kids, of course. So kids learn so much along with Thanksgiving in the schools and lots of other things that Commissioner Anderson talked about. It's a place where you can really see all of the stereotype coming together with all of its different components and attributes. And we can talk more about that if you want in the discussion. Obviously, mascots are a really clear way. And, one of the things that I had to learn to do at Illinois when we were fighting Chief Alinowick there was to be able to try to offer an argument. I was trained to be a scholar, of course, and scholars think about arguments and claims and evidence. And, there were lots of people there at the university, as you find everywhere, who support these mascots, who sometimes you're not sure if they're being transparent and authentic, but there are people who generally don't understand. We don't get what you're objecting to. And so I wrote this essay here on the right. I've asked the organizers to make this available to you in case you want to take a look at it, where I've really tried to take, this was in the context of Illinois and Chief Alinowick now, to take all the arguments, there's about a dozen of them that I heard from Chief supporters at that time for all the reasons the Chief ought to be kept and maintained as a university tradition. And I try to take those seriously and engage them one by one to sort of say, here's why that's not appropriate or acceptable, or why it's not going to achieve or express what you want to express. And so arguments and claims and evidence were pretty important as a developing, even as a graduate student there. I said I'm a psychologist. I've been a card-carrying member of the American Psychological Association since I was a graduate student, 25 years ago, and was proud to be involved to some degree in the adoption of this resolution by the American Psychological Association here on the left, which recommends the immediate retirement of American Indian mascots, symbols, and images. And this was based at that time. I think it even cites that essay I just showed you in the last slide. It also started some early work of the psychologist Stephanie Freiberg, who is Tulalip, and who had done some good experimental social psychology with mascot representations to sort of show how these actually in experimental psychological research limit the horizons of Native students. And so now, if you fast forward 20 years later, on the right, we have this very important article that my colleague Laurel Davis Delano, who's a professor of sociology at Springfield College, and Stephanie Freiberg, who's now at the University of Michigan, we co-authored this together, really under Laurel's really expert leadership. And what Laurel's vision was is we wanted to summarize all of the studies that have happened since way back when there was only one or two, to try to, any research that looked at the psychosocial effects of these mascots on people. And so this particular article, which I've also asked to be made available to those who might be interested, reviews 19 different studies in the social sciences literature. 9 of them are experimental studies. 5 of them use other kinds of methods where you can't necessarily get the cause and effect relationships pinned down. 5 are unpublished master's theses. But the thing that's interesting about these is they really map out in clear form the concrete impacts that these mascot representations have. And just to summarize very briefly, what these studies show is that exposure to these stereotypical representations reduce Native student self-regard and sense of community worth. They increase negative feelings. That's on Native students directly. Beyond that, though, these symbols and representations also trigger negative stereotyping and prejudicial attitudes toward Native people within non-Native people who are exposed to them. So it's not bad enough that Indians have to have their horizons and possible futures limited by this stuff. It's also the case that non-Native people then, by being exposed to these things, have you trigger their own, misguided representations of Indian people in ways that further constrain and limit us. When it comes to Indigenous representations, a lot of this is about getting connection, voice, relationship, and visibility. So I'm just closing today with some representations that are much more meaningful to me and much more organically grounded in Native community life. On the left, this is a sketch that my own great-grandfather, Fred P. Gone, drew in 1942 while he was doing work interviewing my own elders at that time. He was in particular interviewing our most famous medicine person, Bull Lodge's oldest living daughter. And he wanted to know all about Bull Lodge. So he actually ended up writing a biography of our most famous medicine person, Bull Lodge. And one thing he learned about was Bull Lodge got this very powerful shield as a gift in a vision, and then, made a copy of it like he was supposed to, and it protected him in important ways. So this is a representation that comes out of our history and our cultural practices and our religious beliefs that's really, really powerful today in the figurative way that, of course, it was in reality and war and so on back in Bull Lodge's day. And on the right, of course, is the Harvard University Native American program symbol. It has the turtle from many tribal nations. The planet or the globe, the world is referred to as Turtle Island. And so you've got the Harvard, shield right in the center of the turtle. So, there are lots of symbols, representations that Indian people develop and design ourselves, but those aren't the ones that unfortunately our people are most widely exposed to. And I think it's important that we find ways to be able to express our own agency and our own representations among ourselves. On that note, I don't want to take any much more time. I want to hear your comments, your questions, and your exchange, your ideas and response. So I will stop sharing my screen now and give this